Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator, and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of DEI After 5. So as we are continuing these conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, and talking to consultants and practitioners in this space, I thought it was really important for us to have a conversation about the work after the work, right? We all know that this work is very difficult. I talk about it every episode about, the need to fill your cup. But I wanted to have a conversation about, why this work is so difficult, and how we continue the work even after we've clocked out of the 9 to 5. And so today, my guest is an in-house practitioner at a university. Her name is Aisha Gori Ozaki. I want to make sure I'm getting that correct. And we're going to unpack, this conversation today. So Aisha, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Sacha.
So can you start off by telling folks a little bit about you and kind of how you got into this work?
Sure. So I have been in the work officially for about 10 years, and I always sort of talk about the transition to the work. I left higher ed. I was in higher ed for about 18 years and made the transition into the corporate space in a diversity, equity, and inclusion role. And at the time I thought, oh boy, you're really selling your soul. You're going, to the for-profit world. And it was the opportunity for me to be able to make my work that I was doing through volunteer work, through professional associations, through community, and it became my day job. And so that was really through advice of even a really good friend who's like, why don't you make this your day job? And I wasn't entirely sure what that would look like. And so I started that transition. It's probably 12 or 15 years ago, and then made the switch about 10 and have been in that work now for that long. I've recently switched back to higher ed, so in the higher ed academic space as a diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, belonging practitioner, and that's sort of the way that I got here.
Wonderful. And it's so funny because anytime I talk to someone who's in higher education, I'm like, oh, I started in higher education. So I get that. I understand that world really, really well. So, as we were preparing and talking about this, and we were thinking about, okay, what could this topic be? And what I wrote down was like, it's the work after the work, and how for so many people, it's continued, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just 9 to 5 is done. Let me, take off this hat that I wear and move on to this other part of my world. It really is blended. And so talk to me a little bit about that kind of, it's a line that's not even there really for so many people.
Right. I think there's sort of multiple spaces with this, right? On the one hand, how we got to this work, right? So for many of us, it's through lived experience, it's through maybe our own complex navigation within the society or the culture that we were either born in or live in or raised in or working in, whatever that may be. And then in some ways, it's also, I talk about this with the people that I work with. I may be with you because of my job. So in other words, I'm tasked with providing a certain set of services or resources or helping people expand their thinking or learning, whatever, or unlearning and relearning. And also, if you go sort of beyond that, it's this idea that, well, it's great that we do this between, 9 to 5 or 10 to 6, whatever people's schedules are. I find it to be much more beneficial if somebody's living that in their, whether they're at home or not at home, but when they are in their world, because actually work would benefit, right? So what we do during the day, I hope is beneficial. And I certainly believe in the value of that work. I also think like if people go either turn off their computer or return home or air in their communities and nothing's really changed, then that's where it's this, well, it's great that we do it between these windows or within this context, but have we really created the social or cultural or community shifts that ultimately, I believe, will benefit the broader society and world and community? And that's where I think like there's sort of this almost like this, we rub close to it, but we just can't get there.
Yeah.
And so when you think about it, like if for any of us who live the work, which can be problematic as well, because then when are you taking, rest or care? But also, like when you're living the work, you're engaged in it in all aspects of your life, not just at work. So I don't know
You
if
know,
that helps kind of make some of the distinctions a little.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the word that came to me as you were speaking was embodied, right? Where it goes beyond just checking the box of, I went to this DEI training,
Hmm.
checking the boxes to how are you bodying, what you are learning and experiencing. And what does that look like outside of this place that is going to compensate you for this work, right? How are you checking the folks that are at your dinner table
Right.
or in your homes or communities, like outside of this work? Because that could be very scary, right? And there's probably even more accountability outside of the workplace than there is inside of work. And so that's the word that just came to me as you
Mm.
were talking. And it's funny because I was listening to, or I was kind of flipping through TikTok this morning. Like I didn't have other stuff to do, but was doing that and fell down that rabbit hole. And it was just one guy who talked about a white guy that was talking about being a keynote speaker at this event. And he was sitting at a dinner table, like, kind of the networking thing. And one of the leaders, another white male, started to tell a joke that he's like, I can immediately tell it was going to have racial undertones. And the punchline was going to be a Black person. Right. He was like, I can immediately sense that and tell that. And he's like, I have a decision to make in this moment. Do I kind of ignore it and, ha ha ha, halfway laugh at it, or do I stop it? And he
Mm.
was like, that was probably one of the most difficult decisions, to make, because now you're risking your social capital
Mm.
in order to speak up. And he's like, you may lose friends, you may, all of those things, but embodying the work, right? I'm here as a keynote speaker to talk about, how white men show up in diversity and inclusion. This happens. What do I do?
Yeah.
Right. And so it just kind of made me think about, what you were saying. It's not just checking the box to say, I know the knowledge. It's how do I action this every single day in and out of work?
Right.
So that, I think that's just a beautiful way for us to, or well, I can't even say beautiful way. I think that it's the evolution,
Mm.
going back to what you said earlier, an evolution of where we need to go at, what organizations need to do, right? It's not just checking that box, but how does this look day to day?
Yeah. I have to ask, what did he do? Did he say?
He said he spoke up.
Oh, good. Yeah. So that's
Yeah,
where when you live into it, and the first time is probably, I'm sure if that happened to be the first time for that person, it can feel disorienting or
yeah,
uncomfortable, maybe even empowering and uplifting. And then figuring out ways to just live that way all the
yeah,
time. And again, we're all going to mess up. That people are always like obsessed with the perfection, and it's like, look, it's not about the perfection, but it is about a commitment, and that
yeah,
commitment is unwavering. And we're going to learn every day about a new community or a new group or a new set of language or whatever it is that we need to do better, and just keeping that open mind and perspective to saying like, well, how we've done it is not the way we're likely going to be doing it the rest of
yeah,
our lives. And yeah, I mean, so it's nobody, I don't think anybody has ever said this work was easy, that I'm aware of, and
or if they did, they're not doing the work.
they're not doing the work. Yeah,
They're not doing the
unfortunately,
work.
right, and they're not living it. And again, not
Yeah,
not from the perspective of one shouldn't have, some lines between sort of how we live, but um, I guess I mean work in all of the spaces, and it's not
yeah,
just like our day job,
yeah.
so.
And it's so interesting. I mean, one of the things that I'm also learning through this is, though I've been doing this work for a very long time, to your point, you're still learning, you're still growing. There's something new every single day.
Mhm.
And so the flip side of that is allowing grace
Mhm.
when people make mistakes,
Yeah.
right? this whole, oh, I'm gonna cancel you, I'm just gonna totally dismiss you, doesn't help in the process of learning and unlearning. It
Mm,
actually ostracizes people in some ways to buckle into what their beliefs are versus challenging them in some ways. And
right.
so that's one of the things that I'm really starting to grapple with is, what does grace look like in this space when I've caused harm?
Right.
And how much grace should I be afforded? And if that grace isn't given, how do I then sit with that? Right. And so to me, that's also part of this embodiment work. This is part of this
Mm,
empowering, ourselves to grow in ways and places. And it's uncomfortable. It is so freaking uncomfortable.
yep.
um, but that's where growth happens.
Yes. I take this quote from the place that I heard it is the place that I work out. So it's not the same context, but one of the ladies always saying, if it's not challenging you, it isn't going to change you, right? And I think that's the
Mhm.
thing, right? We get so disoriented by the uncomfortability that we can't actually focus on what's necessary, what maybe should never have happened in the first place or is incorrect, rather than feeling like that makes us feel badly or that means we're not good. We put
Mhm.
we attach the wrong meaning or message to it instead of actually focusing on, we didn't have the right information, and maybe that information was controlled and it wasn't because of us being not
Right.
good or not, but now that we have a different lens or a broader lens or more ways of receiving information, that
Yeah.
we now have a different
Perspective.
responsibility and
Yep.
potential accountability in terms of how we can live into what should be happening in the first place or should never have happened. It doesn't mean that
Right.
we can't learn and we can't, somebody recently had asked me something like, but don't you think people are just being like overly sensitive? And I thought, well, that's an interesting perspective. Let's
Mhm.
ask, is that what we think is happening? Or is
Mhm.
it because what we're categorizing as oversensitivity is really our resistance to doing the thing that maybe is now expected of us because it
Mm.
challenges how we were raised or how we've succeeded so far, and who's been afforded success or access or all the things
Yeah.
that, and depending on our experience, we may have had some access to it, we may have had no access to it, we may not even want it.
Yeah.
Others have had unchecked, unchallenged access, right? So, and I think you also were saying this notion of like call in versus call out.
Yeah.
And I just was talking with somebody who was sharing a really powerful experience, and also sort of how one has to manage when you're thinking about your history, and particularly when that history has been suppressed in some ways out of just survival,
Mhm.
and now if a person is ready to kind of share some of those stories or experiences and kind of unpack it, having that time to reflect and to think about, how are you or this person, going to talk about that, and then what's the impact on other folks who now have to think about, wait, that happened, that still is
Right.
happening, and the reality is, and I tell people this at work all the time, if somebody's telling you this one thing that happened to them, you can pretty much get, if you go into a, well, are you sure, and they're so, we go into this like defensive, but
Mhm.
if they're telling you that one thing, the likelihood of it having happened more times than they can even believe,
Imagine.
fathom,
Right.
imagine,
Right.
and probably have put away for so long, like, just listen,
Yeah.
accept,
Yeah. And
breathe,
that's kind of that the choice of gaslighting, right? Because it is a choice.
Oh,
You
it's a
can
choice.
listen, you can understand, you can um support,
Mm,
right? But as soon as you question someone's experience, right? Then now they feel like, okay, well, you don't believe me.
mm,
or I did something wrong, right? Like, so there's this gaslighting that takes place where there's no ownership of kind of what has happened. So, it's that. And there was something else you said earlier that made me think of, when people get defensive in these
Mm.
in moments, it's part of that is a mirror up to their values and beliefs, right? They've held on to these values and beliefs for so long. It's
Yes.
what I got from my grandmother and what I got from my family, all of these things. And as soon as there's something that runs counter to that, that's where the rub begins. And so I appreciate what you were saying about like broadening your perspective and broadening that lens, because the truth that you have always believed may not be the full truth, may not be the full picture.
Hmm.
And so sometimes it does take some self-reflection and understanding of where did this belief come from and what is it rooted in order for me to truly understand, okay, this is maybe not the best way to do
Yeah.
things, right? And that's hard. That's really hard.
And how much energy and work and time is somebody able to put into that or
Yeah.
willing, right? And I think some of us in this practitioner space often are bringing people something new, something different, trying to kind of shift perspective or
Mhm.
understanding, as a way of helping, somebody think about something differently. And any of us who've done this work, I mean, we could probably have a separate conversation about how often somebody sits kind of like looking at you. Sometimes it shows up in their physical
Mhm.
body language. Sometimes it just shows up in the dismissive messaging or ignoring of an email, or whatever it is. Like we all can probably find a variety of ways that we have
Yep.
either been questioned, challenged, dismissed, over whatever, talked over, all of the things that happen. And then when you watch somebody who's actually like stopping and reflecting and thinking and challenging, and then they're like, oh, when I read this thing, oh, or then they start
Right.
sending you articles, or they start saying to you, like, oh, it happened at, my so and so's soccer game
Yep.
or whatever thing in their world. When they notice it in their world, or when
Yes.
that proximity, now, the question that I often raise in all the spaces I occupy in is like, just as humans, we're sort of wired for the proximity to meet, help us sort of drive our willingness to make a shift or a change, right? Like, how close are we? Oh, it's affecting me now. Now I care about it.
Mhm.
But what if we challenge that proximity and say, it doesn't matter if it affects me or my community or my family. I care because it's really important for me to know, and that
Yeah.
like when we challenge the nature of sort of how we are wired, I guess,
Yeah.
imagine then the opportunity, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes I think it's so overwhelming that people get kind of like, oh, I don't know where to start, so I'm just not going to do anything.
And they
Okay,
shut down.
okay, that's one
Absolutely.
way. I mean, that is one way. And, we try to operate in sort of a judgment free, you attempt to have, a judgment free space. And also, like, what are we not what is no longer negotiable, right? What
Yeah.
is non negotiable in these conversations? And
Yeah.
some of that might be, we're not questioning the experience of individuals who are coming from minoritized or marginalized backgrounds, or we're not
Right.
going to we're not going to minimize those any longer. And we're not going to sort of overly, what's the word that sometimes people, you have to keep telling the story over and over, and then it's just more pain
Right.
on top of,
Re-traumatization.
yeah,
Yeah.
re-traumatization. Like, no need for that. And we believe the experience, and we recognize that if we're hearing about it once, the likelihood of its being there more is bigger. And
Mhm.
you know um we all have a different way of doing it, and we've got to do better. And I know we can. It's
Yeah.
just how we do it, and how we live it. And
I love what you said about the proximity piece of it,
mm,
because I think that's so important. And that's where empathy comes in. And, I talk a lot about leadership and this post pandemic workplace, and empathy is one of those um, leadership capabilities that is no longer a nice to have. Like you
Mm-hmm.
have to have some level of empathy as a leader. And, you know, to see so many folks, and I mean, I've facilitated for years,
Yeah.
and to see exactly what you said, the crossed arms or the people that are checked out.
Yeah.
And I recall very clearly doing a facilitation where this gentleman, I mean, he was shut down. Like there was nothing that we could
Yeah.
say that will change his mind on this, because his thought process was he didn't believe that people had different experiences,
Yeah.
right? He's like, oh, it's all in everyone's head. But when we changed it, and what we would do is we would talk about it from different aspects of identity.
Mm-hmm.
When we shifted it to disability,
Mm.
it turned a light bulb on for him, because his wife was in a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how he had to navigate through Disney in a way that was very different. He was like, you know, they try to make it as accessible as possible, but there may be a different route that we have to take, or, you know, and he talked about that. And it was like watching snow melt, because I was just
I
like
love
that.
that.
It was just bringing that
Yep.
proximity, you know, to someone that he loves that has experienced this.
Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, again, and just talking about access to buildings. Are there ramps? Is there an elevator that works? You know, all of those things. And I mean, when I tell you it was night and day,
Mm.
it absolutely was, because then we were able to help him tap into that empathy and that experience to say, now think about the other things that other people have to navigate,
Yes.
right? When you may think it's very easy because you don't have to navigate, right? So now we're talking about levels of privilege. Now we're
Mm-hmm.
talking about, you know, all of those things, access, you know, ability to access resources, et cetera, et cetera. You know, so that actually is a really good segue into my next question.
Mm-hmm.
I segued myself. So let's talk about privilege, right?
Mm.
Because there are folks in this work, and this might hurt some feelings, but there are some folks in this work that have the privilege of turning this work off
Yeah.
at the end of the day. And there are others that don't.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you're as you're doing this work and you're talking to folks that have that privilege, and we touched on it a little bit, but what are some things that, you know, they really need to be mindful of, or they need to um, be cognizant of as they're doing this work? Because again, you shouldn't be able to turn this off.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting thing, right? And I think our degrees of privilege probably might amplify our ability to sort of be more entrenched in the work or not at different times, right? I mean, so it just
Mhm.
may depend. And I may come back to actually this notion of proximity, which is something that's just been playing in my head for a really long time. And we know proximity is used. I mean, even like I think Brian Stevenson does a really lovely thing about proximity, right? Like when you put yourself in the position of getting to know somebody who maybe has housing instability issues
Mhm.
or financial instability issues or is incarcerated, or fill in kind of the minute we put ourselves outside of what has been our maybe kind of lived experience. And also we don't know everybody's lived experiences, so
Right.
somebody may have had some of those experiences and now is in a different situation. Or I was telling a story recently, and I'll come back to but it just reminds me of this. We were having a conversation with some work that we do in the community, and we sometimes will take out groups with us to do some of this community work, and it's
Mhm.
evenings and weekends and whatnot. And one of the things we hear the most frequently is, "Oh, everybody was so nice," or everybody was, whatever the and I'm not, this is not a judgment on that
Right.
observation. This is more a notation on what we have been fed.
Yeah.
So, generally, I think unconsciously, I don't
Yeah.
think most of us, it's a conscious feeding, if you will. And yet it really lives and takes up a lot of space in our head or our heart or our life. And so then when you have some direct connection to the thing that challenges what we have been fed and what we've consumed, consciously or unconsciously,
Yeah.
it then makes us say, I wonder, you know,
Mhm.
and And then when you apply that, and I love the example you shared about the gentleman with the partner in the wheelchair, because most of us, if we don't have an ability issue or need, we're operating pretty standard. But the minute you add some of those things, and then if you add, like in that case, like if you add any other minoritized or intersectional identities on top of that, now how
Yeah.
much more complicated or complex is that person's navigation than, for example, and when you begin to see that happen, right? So I think in the workplace, you know, we try to acknowledge the levels of privilege and then think about proximity. So is it possible that your experience may have limited your understanding of the broader experience
Right.
or the experiences of those who may have had a different perspective? And it's really hard for people, I think, until
They're
they
in it.
observe it or
Yeah.
it's challenged in real time. So,
Yeah.
sometimes I tell people, is there a place you walk by in your neighborhood that you've never been curious about? Is there a reason you would or wouldn't, give somebody an apple or think about something a little bit differently? Or if you have
Mhm.
something, that you cherish, whatever that is there a reason somebody else might not cherish it in the same way? And it's just, but it's
Yeah.
it's so slow, right? I mean,
There's
and
that
that
part.
and that gets where people get kind of either exhausted, checked out, they can't
Yeah.
see themselves in it, they aren't able
Yeah.
to question the media or question, and so some of us might use our, so I mean, I think, like, I sometimes use whatever I can. I these days I'm in the office, kind of a hybrid schedule, so I use my physical space in the office to kind of, people come in, they're like, whoa, there's a lot happening in here. But I'm like, just take a poke around, pick any one thing that maybe would give somebody a, oh, well, that's an interesting
Mhm.
book, or, oh, what do you mean, whatever. There might be like a stack of books or a stack of stickers or something to kind of question and challenge. And it's interesting who engages with the challenge and who doesn't.
Yeah.
And then that's another way, right? Like, okay, and then think about things that we might share through connection or conversation or physical being, right? Like, are there
Yeah.
ways that we can express messages even sometimes when it's not overt? So, like,
Yeah.
what are the things that we can do? And then, you kind of find ways to, you know again, meet folks to some degree, although I don't really live in that space anymore. I'm sort of like, I will do my very best. I will always be kind. It's the nature of who I am, unless somebody's harming someone, I suppose. But, like, my approach is kind and
For sure.
thoughtful, and also, like, you know we are moving forward, and we're,
Yeah.
you got to come
Yeah.
along, and how can
It's
we do
that
that in a
push.
way that's yeah,
It's that push.
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's so much
And
other
as
people.
I'm sitting here and listening and processing, what you're saying, it can be overwhelming.
Sure.
To be constantly doing that. But going back to the question, I think, one of the things that I have noticed, and this is a pet peeve of mine. So if anybody's listening, pet peeve of mine. If anyone is like coming into DEI work and they're like, "Oh, I'm just passionate about it," I'm just like, no, because I'm
Yeah.
not your passion project. Because of my intersectional identities, I'm not your passion project. I need
Yeah.
more than passion. I need commitment. I need, all of these other things that tell me that you are in this for me and not for you.
Yeah.
And so that's the piece around, privilege that I really question folks about, because it's okay after you leave here, right? What do your social circles look like? So, it
Mm.
ties back to what you're saying. What do your social circles look like? What are the opportunities that you're taking to learn about the complexity of other identities, or what's happening in other communities, or challenging, your thoughts or ideas? I was talking to a friend this weekend, a Black female friend, and she said, they went through one of these workshops at work that
Mm.
was very intense, and they put them in groups, small groups. And they said, ask any question that you want to ask.
Hmm.
And an older white woman asked her, like, what do you talk about at dinner? And she said her reaction was like, I don't know, what's going on with school? Like, just the normal things. But for this person to ask that question, she had a very different
Mm-hmm.
expectation of what a Black family would talk about at the dinner table.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like there was an opportunity to unpack that because, again, like, where did that notion come from that it would be something different?
Mm-hmm.
And if it was something different, what was it? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you expecting? And so jokingly, me being me, I was just like, oh, I would say we talk about, a takeover, like the revolution, right?
Yeah.
But that's just me. Um, and so it's so interesting. I love how you say, just this constant challenge of how we are seeing the world and what could be different or what's stopping us. What is behind our actions and behaviors, and really questioning those things, because if you are not willing to question yourself, then you're not willing to question anyone else.
Right.
And so that's kind of the meat in
The
both of
ultimate privilege, I think you've just named the ultimate privilege.
that is it.
I mean, and a lot of people in this work, you might be tapped into the work sometimes based on an identity or series of identities you have, right? So there's folks who are tapped into the work. There are folks who feel like because of a passion that that's a qualification. And I think, the field has shifted enough and is certainly under forever and very recently,
Scrutiny. Yeah.
a lot of pressure and whatnot. And I think I often will tell folks as I'm thinking about them, if people who want to go into this work, is like, you certainly have to have this like care. You have to care about this. So I think passion
Right.
might be like, the ticket at some point to get, but really you can't survive on that because you have to be really patient, there's a ton of other P's, right? You have to be
Dedicated.
really
Yeah.
patient, really persistent. You have to stay positive, but you have to be really practical, and you have to, and you said, even the push that comes into it, because if
Yeah.
we aren't positioning folks to think about the way we've done it has served some folks well, but does not really served most of us in communities that are not sort of the dominant culture have really
Yeah.
not benefited nor seen. And how do you enlist some of that? I mean, you have to sort of, you can't, it's not in spite of that, it's with, right? I mean, you have to kind
Right.
of engage that. And then if we can't get comfortable with the fact that, like, we may be able to sort of schedule technology and we're able to, that's a privilege, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that I don't have other privileges or that I'm not lacking in a number of privileges. It just simply means
Mhm.
we have to acknowledge, and the acknowledgement of it doesn't detract from our commitment, care, concern, or ability. It just
Absolutely.
means that we are truly holding up the mirror, paying attention to the lens with which we look at it, and then saying, this is not enough, like,
Yeah.
again, not everybody's going to have that reaction, but if we can have a reaction that shifts our thinking and practice and, you know
Behaviors.
position, yeah, that's the bottom line. I mean, and
Yeah.
how that's going to show up in all of the spaces that we occupy. And that's where, to me, it's like not just a work thing, but again, often work
Yeah.
is maybe the most diverse access that people have
Right.
in some cases, right? If
Yeah.
nothing else has changed at home, then at least at work, maybe they're being able to, see some things that are a little bit different.
Yeah.
So,
You tend to be more resourced at work, right, for this type of work.
in some
And
cases,
some, right, I was like, for the most part.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it's using that opportunity and that privilege, if you have it, to then use that as a catalyst for the rest of
right.
your life. Um, Aisha, how do you take care of yourself as you're doing all of this? Like, what are the things you do to fill your cup?
Yeah,
Because
I
we
mean,
talked about self-care in the beginning, right? So we're
yeah,
coming back
and
to that.
I always sort of say, like, it's never going to be. I don't think for most of us it's anything like a balance, but I think we do have to take care and find those spaces. I think it's what feeds your soul, and so sometimes, because I'm fortunate enough to have employment and I have access to some resources through that, then can I do things in my non-work life that allow me, whether it's I'm a consistently on a fitness journey, so it's always something that I'm, so you probably, that's one of the ways that I make sure that I'm staying physically healthy to the best of my ability. I'm come from a very spiritual family, so also the spiritual piece, having my family and my friends and my community, giving back is something that means a lot to me personally. So ways that I can be engaged in community and look for ways to do good in a lot of spaces that maybe people are not maybe have overlooked at times. And
Right.
so those are a few of the things that I do. I'm also known as a snack queen. So you will
Oh, I
often, if you
love
ever
that.
need a new recommendation for a snack or a hot sauce, I'm your person. But those are the things, and always looking for I don't know, ways to just be and do
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, I love it. I love
Yeah.
it. So if folks wanted to get in contact with you, what
Mhm.
is the best way for them to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not probably somebody who posts a ton, but I'm happy to always connect with folks. If there's a resource or something that I can make available, don't hesitate to reach out to me there. Certainly, you can email me as well if that's helpful. And, I welcome hearing from folks who are engaged in really good and meaningful work like you. So thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Thanks.
Aisha, thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
being with us today. And thank you all for tuning into this week's episode of DEI After 5. I hope you were able to walk away with a couple of nuggets or something to, challenge you as you continue to move forward in this work. And so you can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. YouTube, your favorite podcast platform, wherever you listen. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share. And until next time, have a good one.